Good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank the Rafael del Pino Foundation for bringing me to Madrid. It's my privilege to be here. I thank all the people who helped organize and the leaders who shared with me their wisdom earlier in the day. I learned a lot about what's on the minds of Spanish leaders, and I think that will be helpful as we continue our dialogue this evening. Now, the book that I wrote, Negotiation, the Game Has Changed, was published in 2025. And for those of you who are familiar with the publishing industry, that means that I finished writing it in 2024. So it was off to press and out of my hands by 2024. As I talk about context, which is going to be a big part of the story, I'll bring up some of the things that I heard on the minds of leaders, many of whom are in the audience today, some of the things that are on their mind that I may not have captured in the book, but it's certainly appropriate for us to talk about this evening. I've been teaching negotiations for a very long time, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful topic to teach. I grew up as a game player, so for me, when I teach negotiations, I'm kind of orchestrating a game, so that part is kind of fun for me. The other thing, and I know we have some negotiation teachers in the room, and I don't mean to insult their skills at all, but one of the secrets that my colleagues don't always like me to share is teaching negotiations is among the easiest things to teach imaginable. People love to learn about negotiation. So I also teach on the topic of decision-making, or what's often now called behavioral economics, or what are the cognitive mistakes that people make. Nobody likes learning about the mistakes that they make. But people are delighted to learn that their negotiation skills aren't perfect. In fact, most people are comfortable with the idea that they're not great negotiators, and they would be delighted to learn how to negotiate more effectively. And one of the things that happens to not just me, but to lots of negotiation professors, is toward the end of the class, a student will come up to me, and they'll start off with a compliment, but sometimes when you're getting a compliment, you know the word "but" is coming after a comma. And I have lots of conversations that feel like that. They tell me something nice about my class, and then a but's coming, and what follows the but, and there's a lot of examples that are up on the chart that I won't read to you, but they tell you something specific about their lives, okay? About the country that they live in, the culture of the people that they negotiate against, the nature of structural changes in the economy, and they say, but can you help me negotiate with my spouse? Okay, and they want to treat that as a different context. And the question is formulated like, and I'm not sure your course dealt with that. And I generally think our course did deal with that. That is, I think that it's good to create value in negotiations with your business partner. I think it's good to create value in a strategic alliance. I think it's good to create value when you're negotiating with your spouse. So a lot of the core concepts that we teach, whether it's think about your alternative, think about your reservation price, think about their side in the negotiation, think about where there are where there are gains from trade that can create value. I think that these are very robust concepts that are relevant across all the buts. But the buts tell us about how we need to contextualize to that specific context. And I can tell you from my morning discussion with some of the foundation leaders, on top of the mind, and I'll generalize from the foundation leaders to this audience, two contextual topics that are on everybody's mind is how do we negotiate when Donald Trump is the president of the United States? So that's a contextual issue that matters. And so it's not going to be in my slides because As I said, my book was written in 2024, but I think it will become part of our discussion later on. And the other contextual topic that is on our minds these days is negotiating in the context of AI in a variety of ways. So again, I think we can come back to those topics. So the fact that there's little about Donald Trump or artificial intelligence in my book doesn't mean that it's off limits in any way at all. So I've written a couple of books on negotiation. In 1992, I wrote a book called Negotiating Rationally with Margaret Neal. In 2007, I wrote a book called Negotiation Genius with Deepak Malhotra. And I'm not willing to admit that anything is wrong in those books. So that's not what the current book is about. It's not a statement that there's something fundamentally wrong with the prior work, but rather we can think more systematically about how context affects these ideas and how to help our MBA students, our executive students, adapt the concepts to their particular context. And there have been some big changes. So 9/11 had a dramatic effect on changing the perception and the power of the United States. The Great Recession suggested that we needed to think about the housing market in some fundamentally different ways. Over the last 20 plus years, many of our societies have become increasingly bifurcated and polarized in ways that affect negotiation. The online economy is a fundamental shift. Before we even get to AI, the fact that at the beginning of COVID, many of us woke up to the fact that the way we typically do our business tasks, we weren't going to continue doing, that we were going to need to shift to doing those same tasks on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever your preferred platform might look like. And each of these changes has had profound implications. If we think about negotiating online, by the way, I was sort of 1 week in March, I was teaching MBA students in person at the Harvard Business School, and when I got an email informing me that next week you'll be teaching online. And I assumed that I was old enough that I would get to die without ever teaching online, that in person would be my basic format of teaching, but all of a sudden I'm online. And that takes a lot of new preparation to think about the nature of the interaction. If you're negotiating and you have a team of negotiators, but you're not all in the same place, I think you need to do more coordination in advance about who's going to say what and when are they going to say it, rather than having one negotiation partner surprise their partner by what comes out of their mouth, which the other side, in fact, hears. Okay, so we could go on and on about how some of these jolts affect things. But some of the core ideas hold, as I was saying at the very beginning. Knowing that we have a term from Roger Fisher and Bill Urey's book, Getting to Yes, called a best alternative to a negotiated agreement, or a BATNA. It's still good advice to know your best alternative to a negotiated agreement before you show up for the negotiation. It's good to think about the other side's alternative. What are they going to do if they don't reach an agreement with you? It's good to think about the zone of possible agreement. It's good to break up what I see in many executives, and that is they have a mythical fixed pie. What's good for me is bad for you, and many people have accused the president of the country that I come from of being guilty of exactly that he views the world with a mythical fixed pie. And one of the things we can do when we teach is we can break that assumption. We know a lot about how to help negotiators create value, and it's still relevant today. We know a lot about the systematic biases of negotiators, and we know a lot about how to think about what biases that we can anticipate from the other side. But there are some phenomena that we've been talking about in negotiations for decades, but I think we know a little bit more about them. So that print may get a little bit small, and I'm not going to stop to read, but I'm going to tell you about what's up here. There are both many research articles and many executives who argue you should start with relatively extreme anchors. Okay, because when you make concessions, you'll still end up at a better point. So if you're a seller, start with a very high price. Okay? And there's research evidence suggesting that that works. But I think it works because in a lot of our experiments, in a lot of our classroom demonstrations, when you make an extreme offer to the other side, they rarely pick up their bags and go home. But when you try to sell your company for 3 times what it's worth, nobody shows up. Okay? You ending up with no deal at a shockingly high rate. So I don't mind anchoring high within the range of reasonableness, but I think that following the advice to anchor extreme is not of particularly good value. And when you're trying to sell your company and you start at 50 million and you come down to 40 million, you come down to 30 million, you come down to 20 million, the other side has no reason to assume that you're done moving. So one of the problems with starting extreme is when you move, you convey to the other side, just keep on waiting, I keep on moving, and they don't have a good sense that you have any reality about what your company is also worth. Another interesting topic where we see conflicting advice is the topic of 50-50 splits. So we have all been in negotiations where the other side has said, we're only $600 off, why don't we split the difference 300-300? And somehow that seems fair, even to people in a capitalist economy, this more communistic idea of dividing things equally somehow sounds fair. And there's a book, popular book by Chris Voss called Never Split the Difference. There isn't actually that much about in the book suggesting you should never split the difference. So it may simply be a problem I have with the title. But it seems to me to never split the difference is just a really bad conclusion. So my spouse Marla's in the front row, and sometimes there's 2 dog walks left in the day. And to say I'll do one and you can do one, that seems like an okay way to resolve a lot of decisions. Or it could be an important decision. It could be an inheritance decision between you and a sibling, and dividing things 50-50 may be a perfectly reasonable way to keep the family happy in some sense. And Voss argues to never split the difference, and he gives an example of, I want to wear a pair of black shoes, my wife wants me to wear a pair of brown shoes, so I shouldn't wear one black and one brown, and that's his evidence to not split the difference. Well, I'd say that that's good evidence in that example. Splitting the difference doesn't make sense, but in other examples it does. Barry Nailbuff, in a book called Split the Pie, gives a much more intriguing argument to say, why don't we just figure out how much incremental value we're creating in negotiation and then split the pie? And he almost in religious-like form argues we should always do that. If I had to pick between the two, I like Nailbuff over Voss. Okay? But on the other hand, when I go buy a car from a car dealer, I'm not all that concerned about the long-term relationship. And if I can do better than splitting the pie, I'm perfectly happy to do so. My former colleague, former because he's passed away, David Messick, argues that splitting the difference, in fact, is a social heuristic. Heuristic in the social sciences means rule of thumb, and we commonly think of cognitive rules of thumb that we use. And he argues that we split things 50-50 not because it's fair, but rather it's a nice rule of thumb so we don't even have to talk about what's fair. Okay? So that you don't have to talk with your sibling about who should get how much of the inheritance. It's just a rule of thumb to make things socially easier. Or when you go out to dinner with another couple, rather than arguing, you ate more than I did, each couple may put one credit card on the table and say, just split the bill. It's not because we ate the same amount. It's we don't want to talk about who ate what. And a 50-50 split solves this problem kind of very, very nicely. Okay. One of the things that I think is fascinating is the topic of ethics, which is another research interest of mine in the context of negotiation. There's a lot in the book about ethics, but I want to provide one interesting story. And all my stories I hear in life. I get lots of stories by being a negotiation professor. And in this story, there's a couple that's been searching for a home, and they're using a friend of theirs as a real estate agent. And the problem is they think that the real estate agent is giving them advice that's good for the real estate agent, but not good for them. And they say, so should I trust this agent? In fact, given that they're giving me advice that isn't in my best interest, should I even be friends with them? Okay? And my reaction to that is that in negotiations, it's important to understand that lots of people provide self-serving advice. Okay? Not because they mean to abuse you in any way, but because we tend to see the world the way we would like it to be. So the real estate agent would like to close a deal quickly, and they see it in your best interest to act in a way that would be consistent with their own material interests. So good people often give us advice that's self-serving for them without being bad people, but it still is biased advice. So we need to understand that a lot of unethical behavior, whether it's sexism or racism, happens without people having intentionality. And a lot of things that happen in negotiation, people may engage in behaviors that you might not find perfectly ethical, but they had no bad intent to begin with. So I think it's important to have some perspective to that. Okay. So I want to share with you kind of a true story, and it comes under the topic of changing the game. So the English title of the book is Negotiations, the Game Has Changed, and much of the book is about how to think about how the game has changed and also how you can change the game in a variety of ways. I had a friend who listed a condo in Cambridge, Massachusetts on the real estate market at a time that the market was a hot market. And she thought that the house was worth a little bit more than $1 million, but her real estate agent convinced her to put it on the market for $989,000. And the agent in this case argued that what we want to do in a hot market is get lots of buyers interested and create a bidding war on the house. And the way this often occurs is that the house will be advertised during kind of midweek, but there will be an announcement that there will be open houses either on Saturday and Sunday or sometimes just Sunday, and then publicly state, and we'll consider offers next Tuesday or Wednesday. Okay? And the idea is to let lots of people come through the house, get multiple people want to make offers, and make sure that we get the offers at the same time to help create this bidding war. That's the proposal of the agent. My friend basically agrees to this plan, and then someone tries to change the game on her in an intriguing kind of way. And on Friday evening, they get an offer that's going to expire on Sunday before the deadline that's been announced to lots of other people. But the offer is for $1.125 million, more than she thought she was going to get for the condo to begin with. And I get an email from her asking for advice, and she includes this piece of an email from her real estate agent who was the one who had proposed this idea of getting simultaneous offers next Tuesday. But now all of a sudden, with an offer in front, he argues you should either take it or counter with just a little bit more and close the deal. And basically say, these are your buyers. So I have a friend, his name's Guhan Subramanian. He's also a professor at the Harvard Business School. He does a lot of work in the merger context. And in the merger context, there's an idea that's called go shop. And if you imagine company A is offering to acquire company B, and B doesn't know what the market is. So it doesn't want to take the offer without learning what the market is, but A says, I'm not going to hold my offer open forever. So do you go with A, or do you go with the offer you have, or do you go out into the market to see if there's other buyers? And the idea of a go shop is an agreement between the first buyer who shows up and the seller that basically says, I hear your offer. If I can't do better, your offer's okay. But I want a period of time to go shop. And what I'll give you in order to give me the time to go shop is I'll give you the opportunity to beat the offer that I get. So the seller is giving the buyer an opportunity to know that they can close the deal, but they might have to pay whatever the market price would actually look like. And I said, so why don't you go back to this very eager buyer and tell them you'll take the offer if you can't do better, but if they let you have the offer open until early next week, then what you'll give them in return is the opportunity to slightly beat the best offer you can find. And that's what she did. And the result, was after a couple rounds of bids, she had an offer for $1.2 million, and the original buyers said, we'll pay $1.21, and she was able to lock in the deal. So rather than thinking about, do I take the 1.125 or do I say no, because she was somewhat nervous that the offer could fall apart, and that was certainly possible, Go Shop provided a different opportunity. Okay, now I want to talk about one other interesting way to change the game, and Danny Kahneman and I call it the final offer arbitration challenge. And the way the final offer arbitration challenge works really comes from 1960s work in labor relations, but also from American baseball, and I'll explain that in a minute. So back in the 1960s, in the labor management field, when labor and management went to an arbitrator, arbitrators were accused of not being wise judges, but rather people who tended to split the difference between the two parties so nobody was very mad. Both sides were only slightly mad. And the problem with this image of an arbitrator is that it could mean that both parties could try to be more extreme, so when the arbitrator split the difference, that would work to their advantage. And as a result, facing arbitration, people might be more prone to remaining extreme, less prone to making reasonable concessions to get a deal done. And this guy, Carl Stevens, comes along and he says, I have a better way to do arbitration. In my revised system called final offer arbitration, the way it works is labor provides a wage, management provides a wage, and the arbitrator has to take one or the other, not a point in between. And some people would say, well, why would you force the arbitrator to one unreasonable price rather than another? And the quick answer is the beauty of final offer arbitration is that both parties get nervous that they're being too unreasonable, and that brings them to the negotiation table. So in the American sport of baseball, and you don't have to appreciate anything about baseball for this story, and final offer arbitration is often called baseball arbitration. In Major League Baseball, when a player and a team can't agree on a price, but they agree that they want to stay together, so they agree that the player will work for the team next year, but there's a dispute about price, they use final offer arbitration. The player names a price, the team names a price, and the arbitrator decides which one's fair. And the amazing part about this is every January, about 100 players file for final offer arbitration, and about 3 actually get arbitrated. Rather, what happens is that the fear of losing to the other side makes the parties more reasonable so that the arbitration process never, ever gets implemented. So this is a system that seems to work very effectively, despite the fact that it's a bit counterintuitive. What Kahneman and I argued in a Harvard Business Review paper, and it's also in the book, is that when you're negotiating with somebody, you can imagine you're an insurance company, and you have a claimant who's asking for a completely ridiculous amount of money. And you want to get them to come to the table. And you have a claim, let's say it's worth $1 million. We can go with yours, €1 million. You've offered them $800,000 to settle, and they want $10 million. And you're confident that any reasonable person would see it as worth roughly $1 million, might be $800,000, might be $1.3 million. The idea of final offer arbitration is proposed to them rather than spend 3 years going through the court system, which it could take in the United States. Why don't we go to an arbitrator next month? We'll both go with a number and an envelope and give the arbitrator the assignment of picking the one that's fair. And when insurance companies implement this kind of process, what happens is that the other side often says, I don't want to go through that process, but they realize that their bluff has been called, and they show up at the negotiation table with a much more reasonable negotiation stance. Because if their $10 million number had been reasonable, they should love this idea of final offer arbitration against this completely unreasonable insurance company. But this highlights, I believe my number, do you? And negotiation processes can begin. So there are a variety of ways that we can think about changing the game. And there are also times where it just doesn't make sense to negotiate. When you're negotiating would recognize an unreasonable anchor, it may not make sense to negotiate. When your actions would accept the illegal or unethical behavior of the other side, it may not make sense to negotiate. When negotiating would reduce your own integrity, you might not want to negotiate. So these are some of the times in which I don't see as negotiation as the answer to all problems. There are times when we want to make a decision that we want to deal with the dispute in some very, very different way. Okay, with that, I believe Professor Pena is going to join me, and we're going to continue the conversation, and then we'll bring all of you into the conversation as well. Thank you very much.